chair back-to-back meetings, so
Ooh, sorry about that.
no, it's okay. It just is how it happened.
These
Okay,
guys are going to make it easy for you once we launch. So
we're good now. Yes, Nicole.
We should be good. Go ahead.
Okay, welcome everybody to the OWEB Tracking and Communicating Committee. Jesse Kirschner, let's see, what am I? Non-voting board member representing OSU Extension. I am one of the committee co-chairs. Claire is the other one. She can't be here today. So we'll just do let's see, I need to remind everybody this is my first time co-chairing a committee meeting, so give me a little bit of space here.
it's okay. You can just read it.
Okay, I will.
Yes.
That we are on a virtual meeting that is being live streamed on OWEB's YouTube channel and recorded. For those of you that are watching on YouTube, the meeting materials are in the board and committee section of the OWEB website. The committee materials are towards the bottom of the page, and viewers can click on the relevant committee and have access to the current meeting materials as well as past meeting recordings. And we're going to go ahead and do a round of introductions. I'll turn it over to Brian as my other board member.
Hi, everybody. I'm Brian Staub. I'm with the U.S. Forest Service, and I'm also a non-voting member representing the federal agencies. Good to be here.
Thanks, Brian. And we'll go over to how about OWEB staff. So Courtney.
Good morning. I'm Courtney Schaff, the Monitoring and Reporting Program Manager at OWEB.
Sarah.
Sarah O'Brien, OWEB's Executive Director.
Audrey.
Good morning, Audrey Hatch, Conservation Outcomes Coordinator.
Ken.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Ken Fetch. I'm OWEB's Effectiveness Monitoring Coordinator and Tribal Liaison.
And Nicole.
Last but not least, Nicole Bettinardi, OWEB's Executive Assistant and Board Liaison.
Okay, thanks everybody. So we have a fairly, not very many agenda items today for the meeting. So we do have space for public comment. I don't believe we received any written public comment. Okay, and I don't see, Nicole, there's nobody signed up this morning. Okay, so we have no public comment. And then what we have on the agenda, we have a Monitoring 101 presentation and time for discussion. And then we'll have some time for wrap up and future projects. And I don't know if there's anything else, Brian or others that you want to add. This sounds good for today.
Great.
Okay.
Well, I will take it away and get us started and share my screen here in a minute. As Sarah and I were talking at the beginning, the other two committees had some pretty weighty topics to kick off with today as they kicked off their new committees. This one is really meant to be kind of the beginning of grounding for this committee of what we're going to talk about. And it's just really great timing as we get ready to adopt the spending plan in July. Thinking about the different spending plan categories that include our monitoring investments, a little bit of background on each one of those, and then really wanting to know from you, Brian and Jesse, and hopefully the other committee members will get a chance to watch this recording. What other areas would you like us to be diving into? What other things would you like to learn more about related to both monitoring as well as the tracking and reporting outcomes that we work on, either at the committee level or at the full board level, so that we can continue to have these conversations. We used to have a committee that focused on monitoring that went to the side as we restructured committees, and we're really excited to have it back and really have this opportunity to do some, have some conversations, do some brainstorming, and really engage with the board at a more small group level about our monitoring investments, how we're reporting out on those investments, and what we should be focusing on, also in consideration of the strategic plan. All right, so even though I tested sharing the screen, I have no doubt I will still make a wrong move here, but we'll see. All right, I think it worked.
You're on it, Courtney. It looks great.
Woohoo! All right, so I covered all right, the other things that I wanted to touch on before and maybe Audrey and Ken, when you guys just get to your first slides, just talk a little bit about what you do at OWEB as you touch on the first slide. But I wanted to ground a little bit in the other things that the monitoring and reporting section does. So besides managing our monitoring investments, which we're going to talk through today and the focus of this meeting today, we're also collaborating with our state, federal, tribal, and local partners on monitoring efforts. One great example is the recent collaboration we did with the Forest Service and the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla on the recent Stage 0 award that the board made. But we're also reporting on the outcomes across the agency from restoration projects, from monitoring projects, from engagement projects. And we do that reporting through maintaining databases and distributing the data through lots of online tools as well as publications. So online tools include the Oregon Watershed Restoration Inventory and the various online tools that we work with Oregon Institute for Natural Resources through the Oregon Explorer to share those tools virtually. And we also have data reported through the Pacific Coastal Salmon Recovery Fund database and county fact sheets, biennial reports. And our intent is in the future is to touch on some of those data tools and reporting mechanisms just to get board members a little bit more grounded in how we are sharing information out and collecting and managing data. So our monitoring grants, just like technical assistance and engagement, are in support of the outcomes listed in the Constitution through Measure 76, which is, acquiring land and water interests, carrying out projects to protect and restore fish and wildlife habitat, and natural watershed functions. So monitoring is in support of those outcomes, just like technical assistance and engagement is. Our monitoring touches on all of the state and federal, local, tribal actions that are occurring throughout the state. And so what Ken and Audrey and I are really wanting to bring home today as we have this conversation is our monitoring actions are really in support of all these things that are happening throughout the state of Oregon at the state, local, tribal, and federal level. And as we're thinking about what we're investing in and monitoring right now, we also want to think about where we want future monitoring investments and coordination to happen. And are there things that we should be focusing on that we're not focusing on right now? Or are there things that we want to learn more about? And how we can use our monitoring dollars to continue to collaborate and tell the story of what's happening around the state. One thing I meant to mention on the previous slide is all of our monitoring investments are lottery funded. So even though we get Pacific Coastal Salmon Recovery funding, we get some salmon license plate funding, all of those funds are used for restoration, engagement, technical assistance. But monitoring is solely funded with Oregon lottery dollars. We don't have any federal funds that we put into that generally, except for one little tiny caveat that we'll talk about. It's also one of the very few sources of funding for our grantees to do monitoring around the state that is consistent and folks know when we're going to have the grant offerings, how much is available through the adoption of the spending plan. So it really is a very important source to support the monitoring that's happening around the state. This slide just shows all the different monitoring programs we are going to talk about today. And so there's a whole bunch of different pieces that all fit into our spending plan through various categories that are in support of all of the investments throughout the agency and support of the strategic plan. I really love that Ken and Audrey pulled this slide together, and it really shows how long we've been making our different funding investments and what those programs are. and then how many grants we've made over that same period, and then what the total investment amount is. You can see obviously open solicitation and effectiveness monitoring have been around really since the beginning. And then we shifted into special investment and focused investment programs. And then more recently, the strategic implementation areas and telling the restoration story grants. And as we walk through today, we're going to dive into each one of these programs, talk a little bit high level about what the intent of the program is, and then give a couple examples of projects that we have funded under those programs. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll circle back and look at what the proposed spending plan is for 25, 27, and see if you have any questions, either that we should think about ahead of the July board meeting and then for future committee meetings. So before I turn it to Ken, Sarah or Jesse or Brian, any questions or comments or thoughts? Seeing head shakes of no. So Ken, go ahead.
Perfect. Thanks, everybody. For the record, my name is Ken Fetcho. I'm OWEB's Effectiveness Monitoring Coordinator and Tribal Liaison, and just really appreciate the space to provide a lot of context in our investments and how Oregon is supported by OWEB's monitoring grant investments over time. And so that table is a good summary. Those are all monitoring grants, just to be clear on that table. So over $60 million since 1997. We're really proud of that work and the information that we've supported the creation of. And so, Courtney asked both Audrey and I to provide just a little bit more background on, what do we do here and how do we get here? And so, what is that background that we bring to our day-to-day work? And so I do want to share some of that. So I've been here at OWEB since September of 2013. So going on 12 years now. And, my role, and again, just speaking about the monitoring grant program role, not the tribal liaison role, which I've described in other presentations to the board, is to help coordinate those monitoring grant puzzle pieces that you saw in that blue slide previously, and work closely with Audrey and Courtney on those efforts. And so, basically starting last year, I now manage a majority of those grants that are funded in those different monitoring grant programs. So not only do I help our applicants apply for those funds, but once they're funded, I help administer those grants and support our grantees as they implement their monitoring grant projects. And I also work closely with Audrey to communicate what we are learning from those monitoring grants, to describe the outcomes that are emerging from our investments in watershed work. And so one of the things that we also do, Audrey and I spend a lot of time participating what we call interagency coordination and collaboration across the state with state, tribal, and federal natural resource agencies that are also interested in monitoring watershed conditions and measuring the changes associated with restoration actions, to help communicate that progress that we're making in spirit of the Oregon Plan for Salmon and Watersheds. So that's my role here. And I take a lot of pride in the work that we all do together in Oregon. So just a little bit of background on how I got here. So as we heard, I've been here for 12 years. I started my career just like many of us in college. So where I studied forestry at Humboldt State University. Back then, I had a few summer jobs while still in school and worked for grad students, helping them collect their field data for their theses. I was fortunate enough over the sort of during that time and after, I had several seasonal field technician jobs collecting vegetation, wildlife, fisheries related data for a variety of agencies, federal agencies and universities. Before I moved to Oregon and started to work for OWEB, I worked for the Yurok Tribe Environmental Program for 12 years, where I really obtained a majority of my water quality and hydrologic monitoring experience. And so these 25 years of experience in performing monitoring that then has shifted to funding monitoring projects has really formed my foundation along with my education that enables me to show up every day and work to help our agency and the state of Oregon understand the outcomes that emerge from our investments. So that's just a little bit of background on me. Happy to tell you any stories about working in past jobs in the future, but not today. Now I'd like to kick off this presentation by just providing a summary of the most broad-reaching funding opportunity to support monitoring in Oregon, and that's through our open solicitation monitoring grant program. And this is what we describe as a responsive monitoring grant offering, where we basically open up the application and say, y'all come submit the project, we'll review it. If it meets our criteria and it's recommended for funding, you'll get some money to collect some data and share those findings. So we do a lot of work to help our applicants prepare those competitive applications before they even get reviewed. So the intent of the open solicitation monitoring grant program is to provide funding for really four things: to describe current watershed conditions, to identify the status and trends of habitat, fish, and wildlife populations, and/or water quality and quantity. Also to help determine, those funds can be used to determine if restoration projects are meeting their biological and ecological objectives to inform future restoration and acquisition projects. And the idea there is for them to feed information into their adaptive management cycle by incorporating new knowledge into future scoping, planning, and implementation of on-the-ground work. And so, as you saw from that table, OWEB has been offering open solicitation monitoring grants since 1997. And we have funded a total of 547 open solicitation monitoring grants. 489 have been completed, and currently there are 76 that are open or in progress that were awarded through the open solicitation grant offering. And so you'll see a few of these maps. So the maps here show the completed projects in dark circles, and the ones that are sort of in these open hollow triangles, those are the ones that are currently in progress. And it's just important to note that based on our data systems, there are about 40 completed projects that could not be mapped because back then, early on, we didn't collect that information. And it's also important to note that these are just single dots that represent an individual monitoring grant. And that information is provided to us in the application. And just keep in mind that most monitoring grants, they're collecting data in more than one spot. So there's several sites, but this information we're showing here is just a single dot they provide us that they feel represents the location of their monitoring grant. So open solicitation monitoring grants are offered once a year. And starting this year, they're accepted in the summer. Applications that are accepted in the summer in August. And that'll kick in a 5 to 6 month review process. And in the January 2026 board meeting, you guys will vote, or not you, Jesse or Brian, but your colleagues at the board will make a funding decision to fund those grant applications that were recommended for funding. Real quick, starting in 2024, the Oregon Plan Monitoring Team is the sole review team that reviews open solicitation monitoring grant applications that are submitted statewide, and they make the funding recommendations. This is one distinct change in the open solicitation grant program where the regional review teams no longer review or make funding recommendations for the monitoring applications that are submitted. Finally, once the monitoring grants are awarded, I serve as the OWEB project manager to administer the grants, and the RPRs, or regional program representatives, no longer manage new monitoring grants that are awarded via this grant offering. And so real quick, since 2015, so over the last 10 years, we have received between 20 to 35 applications per year, and we award about half of those that are submitted. So for example, in 2024, so last year, we received 20 applications, 16 were recommended for funding by the Oregon Plan Monitoring Team, and we were ultimately able to fund 12 of those before we ran out of money. So 4 of those were below the funding line. So next slide, please. So I'm gonna to really help you guys understand, well, what does that look like? And, and I'm going to provide 2 examples of monitoring grants that were typically funded in open solicitation. The first one that I'm going to share here is what I call a continuation or long-term monitoring. And that's basically where applicants have applied for and received funding over several cycles to meet their long-term monitoring needs. And so just a great example of a long-term monitoring project that builds on previous monitoring grants is the Partnership for Umpqua Rivers Collaborative Monitoring Project. We just last year, you guys awarded funding for them to continue their work in 2025 and 2026. That again was funded last year. So the Partnership for Umpqua Rivers, or PUR, as they're known, routinely applies for 2 years status and trend monitoring grants that has allowed them to collect water quality data by rotating through fifth field watersheds in order to collect 3 years of data across the entire Umpqua Basin in a thoughtful and coordination approach. And they're well under their way in collecting that information. So their monitoring has been instrumental in identifying areas of concern and prioritizing streams for restoration, enabling practitioners to make informed decisions and allocate resources effectively. Some examples of how their data is applied by state agencies as well is that they share that information with DEQ and Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and Department of Environmental Quality. And that has informed state decisions to list impaired water bodies and also develop total maximum daily loads, or TMDLs, to help basically describe broad watershed scale plans to improve water quality. And then also with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, they've shared information and collaborated with them to help them develop water temperature models and to contribute to their ongoing statewide study for locating cold water refugia. Next slide, please. So another example that I'm going to share is indicative of grants that are submitted to address a local organization's discrete need and are not seeking funding from OWEB over the long term. And so last year, the board funded the Long Tom Watershed Council grant application titled Fire Effects Monitoring, Developing a Framework for Evaluating Cultural and Ecological Health. So this project seeks to bring together Western scientific and indigenous knowledge systems to develop a fire effects monitoring framework that will help improve burning strategies in the Willamette Valley with the goals of enhancing ecological diversity and supporting tribal cultural priorities associated with burning. And the partners are collaborating with a variety of partners that are interested in and actively doing this work. So Eco Studies Institute, Confederate Tribes of Grand Ronde, and the Confederate Tribes of Siletz Indians, the Nature Conservancy, the Upper Willamette Stewardship Network, and City of Eugene and Bonneville Environmental Foundation. So next slide, please. So, with this theme of this puzzle, right? If you think about, how to monitor and implement watershed work in Oregon, it's a puzzle, right? And Oregon's OWEB's funding helps assemble the puzzle pieces. And so we spent some time thinking about, how does open solicitation help us assemble that puzzle in Oregon? And so we've highlighted here some of those puzzle pieces in yellow that we feel this offering is providing responsive grants to help meet local partners, state, federal, and tribal data needs to address many actions identified in a variety of plans across an array of interagency collaborative efforts. So we're getting, to hopefully see how this funding fits into this giant puzzle in Oregon. Next slide, please. So OWEB also funds monitoring grants to support the data needs through our Focus Investment Partnership. And as a brief reminder, the Focus Investment Partnership, or FIP, is an OWEB grant program that awards 6 to 10 years of dedicated funding to high-performing partnerships that are implementing restoration in a discrete geographic location that is guided by a strategic action plan to help address one or more of the board identified ecological priorities listed here. And you will recall that our board and staff are currently working on a year-long process to review and revise these ecological priorities. So monitoring grants help the partnerships implement monitoring to guide their restoration actions and to perform effectiveness monitoring that assists them in describing their progress towards meeting short-term ecological outcomes and adaptively managing ongoing and future restoration actions. So today, you can see in that map, we have funded 85 monitoring grants through the FIP grant program. 53 have been completed, and there are 32 monitoring grants that are currently open or in progress. Next slide, please. So the one example, how do you pick one example across all those ecological priorities over all those grants? So the one that I thought really was sort of just illustrative of the value of monitoring and focused investment partnerships is multiple grants, monitoring grants that were funded in the Baker Local Implementation Team, or LIT FIP, that is meeting the sagebrush, sage steppe habitat ecological priority, and was funded in cohort 2. The Baker LIT partners have worked together with their partnership to develop a what they call a monitoring handbook, but really is just several documents that has their monitoring protocols and study design and their approach to monitoring the effects of their projects to help contribute towards sage grouse conservation efforts. So they're really focused on really embracing the benefit of monitoring to better understand the effects of one of their main restoration actions, which is to treat invasive annual grass and broadleaf weeds to really apply that information to help inform current and future restoration projects. They've really embraced refining their monitoring and applying that over time, and working with Oregon State University, the Institute for Natural Resources, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, the United States Geological Survey, and the United States Fish and Wildlife Service to refine those methods and develop data storage and analytical tools. So by entering their treatments and monitoring into the landscape treatment exploration tool, which is a database, it's ArcGIS Online database. It's helping them inform local conservation efforts and understand how they are contributing towards larger scale efforts across private and public lands. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Audrey to cover this next slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. We will talk about focused investment partnership, effectiveness monitoring, and how progress is tracked. First, as requested by Courtney, just a little bit of background about myself, the Conservation Outcomes Coordinator. I've worked at OWEB since 2016. The Conservation Outcomes Coordinator staff position was established at that time to really add capacity to help our staff and help our board demonstrate outcomes from all of the agency's various investments. This position and many of the initiatives that are a significant part of the portfolio of this position were established in response to board interest and established to provide broad service to the state of Oregon. Before I came to OWEB, I worked at the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife on one of the puzzle pieces in our puzzle slide, which is the Oregon Conservation Strategy, or Oregon State Wildlife Action Plan. I have also worked at Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and led initiatives to help quantify and map fish and wildlife habitat throughout the Pacific Northwest. So my position at OWEB works statewide throughout Oregon. It is based in Salem. I live in Corvallis. I went to Oregon State University with a PhD in zoology focused on amphibian habitat. And I came to Oregon from Texas, but I came by way of Scotland. A little bit out of the way there, but here we are. And we're going to talk next about how progress is tracked for the FIP initiative. So kind of continuing on with that Baker Local Implementation Team example, we are showing some information here that's excerpted from the progress tracking reports that are produced for each FIP initiative and are provided to the OWEB board. These PTRs are the primary means for communicating progress throughout the life of each of the FIP initiatives. FIP effectiveness monitoring is one of the items included in that quantifying outcomes budget item of the OWEB spending plan. And this funding has been used to work with the team, including Bonneville Environmental Foundation, that helped develop a framework to track progress for each one of those FIP ecological priorities that Ken just touched on. Those priorities were identified by the board. Each ecological priority has a theory of change, and that theory of change describes the reasoning for how the strategies and actions are expected to lead to near-term and longer-term ecological outcomes. That theory of change includes strategies, actions, and outputs from the implementation of those actions and those longer-term outcomes that are expected to result over a longer period of time. We know it takes quite a while to see progress from conservation and restoration actions. And as Ken mentioned, the FIP initiative is a 6-year initiative, but in the life of the ecology, 6 years goes by pretty fast. So that full theory of change that's been developed through that team, including Bonneville Environmental Foundation, is a really complex wiring diagram. But for each of the progress tracking reports, a simpler full-page graphic, like the one that's shown on the right-hand side here for the Baker, is included in each report. So this graphic is a one-page kind of synopsis, and it shows the initiative's goal at the top and their anticipated outcomes at the bottom. And in the middle, that graphic is an opportunity to highlight implementation progress. And we're kind of showing that as bubbles here. That implementation progress comes from the current biennium for each one of these reports. As part of their strategic action plan, each of the FIP initiatives develops a progress monitoring framework, and that identifies a subset of key outputs that can be more thoroughly monitored to track progress and inform adaptive management. By the time of their first formal progress report to the board, each initiative has finalized that subset of outputs that they intend to track throughout the life of their initiative. And they also identify a realistic target that they anticipate achieving throughout the life of the initiative. This example at the bottom kind of left-hand side of the slide shows progress toward the target that was set for treatment of annual grasses. And in the case of the Baker local implementation team, this graphic also shows the role of additional partner actions in addressing the strategy for the ecological priority. Progress towards this subset of outputs is published as part of each of the PTRs produced throughout the life of the initiative. And several resources are available for use by all restoration practitioners that have been developed through the partnership with Bonneville Environmental Foundation under this FIP ecological monitoring budget line item. So these resources include guidance documents on monitoring restoration initiatives, guidance documents on adaptive management, and producing a strategic action plan, as well as that theory of change for each of the current FIP ecological priorities. So just to wrap up real quick, this slide is showing you a couple examples from the Baker FIP and from their progress tracking reports. But the purpose here is to show you an example of how all of this FIP effectiveness monitoring is working through those different resources. And so FIP monitoring and FIP effectiveness monitoring really just help describe progress towards several of the pieces in the monitoring puzzle. I mentioned that State Wildlife Action Plan up in the right-hand corner, but also certainly the Oregon Plan, various fish habitat, water quality plans, and intensively monitored watersheds, and OWEB strategic plan and species recovery plans. Thank you. And back to Ken.
Yep, thank you. I just had to find the mute button. So our next monitoring grant program that we're going to now highlight is different than the open solicitation and the focused investment partnership. Okay, so a different pot, if you guys will. And so another way that we support monitoring in Oregon is what we call the programmatic effectiveness monitoring grant funding program opportunity. And that's funded through the quantifying conservation outputs and outcomes line item of your spending plan. The intent of the effectiveness monitoring grant program is to evaluate outcomes of restoration actions at a broader scale to describe the cumulative impacts from our investments. The programmatic effectiveness monitoring grants are targeted grant offerings that are developed in close collaboration with grantees and are funded less frequently than the other monitoring grants. When I look back in the database to help prepare for this presentation, to put together that table that you guys saw earlier in the slide deck, we've been funding programmatic EM or effectiveness monitoring since 1997, and OWEB has funded a total of 103 of those effectiveness monitoring grants. 98 have been completed, and currently there are 5 that are open or in progress. So much smaller, discrete investment, much more targeted. Okay, and so one of the things that kind of helps direct our work was that in 2013, the board adopted a long-term investment strategy that guides its investments. One of the elements of the strategy included integrating effectiveness monitoring across all of its programs to evaluate and report on the progress and outcomes of the watershed work that we support. It's important to note that OWEB is not just interested in ecological monitoring or physical or biological monitoring. In the past, we have also funded socioeconomic monitoring with these funds. And a few years ago, we completed an assessment of the impacts of Watershed Council and Soil and Water Conservation District operating capacity grant program. Next slide, please.
Wait, Ken, can I ask a question?
Sure. Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit more? You said that these are developed in close collaboration with partners. Can you tell a little bit more about like how the ideas get generated of what the project ideas are? Who do they typically come from? Or like when you look at the portfolio of ones that have been funded, are there some that OWEB has gone out and said, this is something we're interested in, who would be a good partner for that? Or has the board driven some of that? Like, can you just talk a little bit more about how these projects come to be?
And I want to jump in really quick and clarify that some of these, like the operating capacity evaluation, have been funded through the operating side of the funding and haven't been funded with like necessarily the grant side. There have been a couple of times during the history of our investments where we've said, hey, this is something bigger where we might want to go out for an RFP and have a contractor come in and do some programmatic effectiveness monitoring versus doing a grant offering where a grantee is proposing to us something. So there is a little bit there, but I think I'll let Ken answer, but I think this is also a great place to flag where this is a space that we would love to hear ideas from the board and where ideas have come from the board in the past and a place that we want to continue to have dialogue with this committee about where should we have future programmatic investments. Ken.
Thanks. And Brian, you too, like, please pause us to ask questions as we go. Because I think that's going to be more helpful for all of us. So great question, Jesse. And so I've been here 12 years, so I can just, share what I've experienced from my time here, right? And so we used to have a monitoring board committee, and I think a lot of that work happened through that, identifying these priorities, if you will, and then working on those with greater communication with the board. But also some of that stuff comes from just our ear to the ground, like seeing things coming up that are getting a lot of attention. And so, for instance, I'm going to dive into this Tidegate effectiveness monitoring example, but I'll just touch on like the stage 0 effectiveness monitoring or, valley-wide floodplain restoration efforts that take a valley reset with using a lot of heavy equipment to fill stream channels, and then release the water back after a lot of wood's been placed to recarve a channel, sort of reset the floodplain. That back several years ago, it's much more accepted now, but a while ago, I want to say, before COVID, so 2018, our review teams were struggling with those restoration actions and hearing a lot of concern from regulatory and land management agencies. And so that was one of the things that we were sort of really in tune with and wanted to engage the community of practice to help better understand the complexities of that restoration and sort of the outcomes that emerge after those restoration actions, and what are maybe some unintended consequences that may occur from those relatively broad and innovative restoration actions. So that's just one example how that had come through. So I'd say a variety of ways, but really for us to be really in tune with the community of practice and restoration needs, but also with our leaders, our decision makers within the agency, direct us to work on. So is that helpful?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, cool. So the one example I already talked about stage 0. So I'm going to talk about tide gate effectiveness monitoring, which is also a big deal here on the coast of Oregon. So, and really to underscore sort of the impact of our investments in effectiveness monitoring, this tide gate project, a long effort, is just a great example. So in 2016, the then OWEB board's monitoring subcommittee and staff identified tide gate restoration investments as a priority area to investigate via effectiveness monitoring. And so shortly thereafter, the board provided funding to the Institute for Natural Resources at Oregon State University to investigate the collective lessons learned from the tide gate restoration projects by performing a literature review and data compilation and summary effort. This effort produced a comprehensive 447-page report in 2018 that described the effects of tide gate restoration projects from existing literature that spanned the Pacific Northwest and also included a few papers from Europe. This report also compiled findings and lessons learned from the tide gate restoration and effectiveness monitoring of OWEB and non-OWEB funded tide gate removal and tide gate replacement or upgrades projects in Oregon. Then in 2021, I worked with Jillian McCarthy and we also worked with Institute for Natural Resources and tide gate restorationists that are actively working on these projects in Oregon to take those 447 pages and create a 29-page bulletin that summarized the findings from that 2018 tide gate literature review report. The bulletin also incorporated feedback and lessons learned from those tide gate practitioners and work that they had done since that report was completed. And so this bulletin, and when we developed it, still available and relevant to the work today, is intended for a technical audience and focused on providing clear recommendations for those designing and implementing tide gate restoration projects. Finally, in 2024, with a grant from OWEB, that came out of the governor's priority line item. At one point, tide gates was one of those things that was a governor's priority and provided help direction in our spending plan. We provided a grant out of that to the Coquille Watershed Association, the Nature Conservancy, and the Tillamook Estuaries Partnership to develop a tide gate and tidal wetland monitoring guidance and protocols for estuary practitioners handbook. This project was inspired by the 2018 literature review report that recognized the need for a standardized set of tide gate monitoring protocols. And to develop this document, the tide gate community was surveyed and interviewed to determine what was needed to guide practitioners through implementing a statewide standardized monitoring framework. So now, fast forward, to 2025, there are several tide gate effectiveness monitoring projects that are being funded that folks are proposing to us on their own through open solicitation and through the FIP monitoring grants across the Oregon coast. And this is just a great example how the vision of at the time, the monitoring subcommittee of the board helped prioritize tide gate effectiveness monitoring, and how that funding really elevated our understanding of restoration investments, and how that spawned several important guidance documents that restoration and monitoring practitioners now benefit from. And now they're continuing that work to collect vital data by leveraging other OWEB monitoring grant opportunities. So I hope that kind of helps understand sort of how some of these different grant programs fit together to help support monitoring needs in Oregon. So I'll turn it over back to Audrey. Thank you.
Thanks. And real quick, I'll just pause and see if there were any questions. I saw a couple of folks maybe coming off mute. All right, seeing none, we'll head into the telling the restoration story piece. This is a small targeted grant offering. It's funded from that board spending plan line item called quantifying conservation outputs and outcomes. And because of this connection to the spending plan, the telling the restoration story funding covers data compilation and data analysis. And that results in data-driven outreach products that then can help inform future restoration, including acquisition. The offering was initiated in 2018 based on board member interest to identify potential applications for this targeted offering. Ken and I work with OWEB's regional program representatives in the grants program. To date, the focus of telling the restoration story has been on outcomes from OWEB's open solicitation projects, restoration, land and water acquisitions. As part of these early internal discussions when considering a new project, staff also explore whether there's sufficient monitoring data available to help the potential grantees document their restoration outcomes. And then when an area of focus has been identified for a telling the restoration story project, staff meet with local partners to explore their interest and their capacity. We make sure to identify their data compilation and data analysis needs before discussing what specific audiences they plan to reach, typically targeting restoration practitioners working in similar landscapes. We also ask potential grantees to share other important components of their story, such as the partnerships that were really essential for that restoration success. Sometimes these partnerships include other funders and private landowners. So the Telling the Restoration Story offering helps fill a niche to fund data compilation and analysis of existing data, and then use that data to develop outreach products like fact sheets, videos, and online story maps. So these data-driven outreach products then communicate outcomes with different audiences to support future restoration or future acquisition actions. And so far, 11 Telling the Restoration Story projects have been completed. As you can see, they are generally distributed throughout the geographic regions of the state. 10 of these projects use the OWEB Telling the Restoration Story funding. One did not need the funding, but followed that same data-driven outreach product model. 5 more projects are currently in progress at this time, and 3 are under active consideration and exploration. So from those 11 completed projects, the offering has produced 10 published standalone fact sheets, 9 published standalone technical reports, 7 online story maps, and 6 videos. The grantees from these efforts distribute their data-driven outreach products to the specific audiences that they identified at the time that they apply for the funding with OWEB. The grantees host their data-driven outreach products and track the use of them over time, along with their existing organization's workflow for tracking communications and outreach. And we discuss their plan at the time of application for the Telling the Restoration Story funds. 6 of the projects have been featured in depth at OWEB board meetings. So these data-driven outreach products help inform future restoration, and they're also used by the Oregon Lottery in demonstrating the impact of lottery funding throughout the state of Oregon.
Audrey,
So-
can I ask a
yeah.
question? Yep, a general question. So for most of the grantees, are they sharing like ecological, impacts or outcomes as opposed to like socioeconomic or like community-based ones? And are there ones that have done more of those socioeconomic based outcomes or anything? That's my question.
Yeah, thank you, Jesse. The question, are they mostly actually focusing on the ecological outcomes in practice? The answer is yes. And then are there some that have focused more on socioeconomic outcomes? To date, the answer is no. There is one project in place currently with, it's focusing on the Plants for People restoration model. That project will likely demonstrate some community-based metrics such as working with tribes and engaging different ways of traditional ecological knowledge in the products, but that project is currently in progress and not yet completed.
Thank you.
And I would just add the Plants for the People and thinking a little bit more outside the box of telling the restoration story was really an encouragement from, again, a board member coming up with an idea of, do you think we could look and think outside the box for some of these telling the restoration story? And so it's, again, a great example of, we really want to hear from board members, from this committee of, are there gaps? Are there stories we're not telling? Are there places that we should making an investment that align with the Measure 76 objectives that we haven't been yet to? Or are there things that you're aware of that we're not aware of where we could be engaging? So open to all ideas, and then we can we go back and talk to grantees, talk to local partners, and think of opportunities for future investments. Back to you, Audrey.
Yeah, thanks, Courtney. Again, as you mentioned, touched on, Courtney, it's helpful to note that that concept came from board member interest, and the offering itself came from discussion with the board and board member interest, and kind of some inclusion of that monitoring board committee that Ken referenced. So next, to show you one example telling the restoration story project, so you can get a sense of how these work. We'll take a moment to look at the Zumwalt Prairie, which is in the northeast corner of the state, up near Enterprise in Wallowa County. The area has received over $4 million in OWEB funding since 2001, including investments in acquisitions, weed removal projects, and other restoration actions. It's also a place where there's been active monitoring. So the Zumwalt Prairie Preserve is also the largest remnant of Pacific Northwest bunchgrass prairie. That means it is home to many diverse songbirds and raptors and many diverse pollinators. So the Telling the Restoration Story project was completed in 2024 and included a technical report that synthesized over 20 years of published studies on pollinator habitat. And that report was also able to include some work in the Starkey Experimental Forest, allowing for additional information from a similar habitat to be included. The application grantee team produced an online story map and 3 fact sheets. One of the fact sheets describes the pollinators found in the habitat. One describes how to select plants to promote those pollinators in the habitat. And one of the fact sheets is for livestock producers, and it really focuses on describing how the timing of grazing can be managed to support pollinator populations, resulting in mutual benefits for people and for local ecology at the same time. So this example demonstrates how the Telling the Restoration Story funding covers that data compilation and analysis piece, tying back to the quantifying conservation outcomes in the OWEB spending plan. And it resulted in a technical report. And that data was then used to inform and deliver really data-driven outreach products that can be used to help inform future restoration actions. And wrapping up on Telling the Restoration Story, the offering helps inform the Oregon Plan, recovery plans, intensively monitored watershed efforts, as well as various state and local planning efforts. And the data-driven nature of the outreach products is the reason why the offering's part of that quantifying conservation outcomes line item in the OWEB spending plan. Thank you. And next, I guess any last questions over Telling the Restoration Story? Not seeing any, but just want to pause for a second. All right. Next, we'll talk for a second about strategic implementation area monitoring. Strategic implementation area grants are also part of that OWEB spending plan. OWEB administers the grants on behalf of the Oregon Department of Agriculture. So these strategic implementation areas, or SIAs, are identified by ODA. And then the SIA lead partners, typically these are soil and water conservation districts, are eligible for $125,000 in technical assistance funding. And at least $25,000 of that amount is to go towards monitoring. So talking a little bit more about that monitoring, to fulfill the monitoring objectives, to fulfill those objectives, each grantee works with ODA staff and convenes a local monitoring team. And that includes representatives from DEQ and ODFW, as well as other partners who are key to success in the area. For example, a local tribe or a watershed council. So that local monitoring team uses guidance from the state agencies to develop a really specific, locally driven monitoring proposal for the SIA. And then that local team also gets additional feedback on their proposal from a statewide review team that includes many of those same key state agencies: Oregon Department of Agriculture, Environmental Quality, Fish and Wildlife, OWEB, and it also includes it also includes Oregon State University Extension. The focus of SIA monitoring is on water quality and habitat condition. Most, but not all, of the SIAs are monitoring water quality parameters. Since the funding model began with that 2017-19 biennium, results have shown that SIA monitoring is a good opportunity to collect baseline data in remote areas where there's often little background information. So to date, 35, if we could go to the next slide, please. 35 SIs have been funded to date since that 2017-19 biennium under this funding model. And of those, over 20 have now convened local monitoring teams, developed and approved monitoring proposals, and started to collect information on the ground. Soil and water conservation districts are leveraging partnerships and contractors to achieve their monitoring objectives, as well as working to increase their own capacity through this monitoring funding. The state team of agencies, so ODA, DEQ, ODFW, and OWEB and OSU Extension, regularly discuss how the SIA monitoring efforts help inform initiatives, such as state water quality planning efforts. And briefly, several of the SWCD SIA grantees have developed projects because of the SIA program and this funding, and have worked on submitting applications to various OWEB programs, including small grants and our open solicitation grants. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Audrey. One thing that we're seeing this cycle as monitoring applicants get ready to submit monitoring grant applications, we have 3 SIAs that have already contacted us to request additional funds to build on that initial $25,000 of monitoring funding that was provided, a sort of seed funding that was provided through the SIAs. So just wanted to touch on that. And we've always offered that. We've always told folks $25,000, we understand, is not enough to meet all their monitoring needs. If they want to continue to work on that, they can pursue open solicitation funding to continue that work. So it's just nice to see that vision working after all those years of sort of a lot of thought put into it. So this next slide is an example of a long-term effort that supports agricultural water quality collaborative monitoring approach, which really is illustrated by the monitoring now that's occurring through the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, or CREP. And so CREP is it's a federal program through the Farm Services Agency, but in order for it to exist, you need a state partner. OWEB is the state partner, and essentially provides funding to private landowners to protect riparian buffers. Through 10 to 15 years, they get economic incentives to implement a suite of conservation practices to enhance the riparian buffer. And to not, crop it or to graze that area that often is fenced, and it also excludes livestock. So in 2015, Stillwater Sciences was contracted. You heard Courtney reference sometimes in programmatic effectiveness monitoring, we don't use grant funding. We have another pot of money through the operational side of our budget to hire a contractor. But this was a priority that we discussed with the, at the time, monitoring subcommittee through the board. And it was actually required in the CREP agreement with FSA, Farm Services Agency, and Oregon. And so we contracted after a request for proposals, a lengthy process. Through competitive process, we hired a contractor, Stillwater Sciences, to develop and implement an effectiveness monitoring study of CREP in Oregon. And the overall intent of this statewide study was to assess the effectiveness of the conservation practices implemented under the CREP program to improve riparian conditions. After this project was completed in 2017, OWEB met with the OWEB-funded CREP technicians to explore and develop a feasible monitoring approach to meet the annual monitoring requirement in that CREP agreement with the state of Oregon, OWEB, and the Farm Services Agency. And so in 2019, we worked with 5 CREP technicians in Oregon to pilot a monitoring approach to track CREP contract performance and inform the management of CREP buffers. So this monitoring approach includes completion of an implementation monitoring checklist. That includes meeting on site with the landowner and asking them a few questions and just really seeing how things are going out there and making several observations. It also includes repeating the Stream Visual Assessment Protocol, or SVAP, on a subset of active contracts. In 2020, after that pilot study was completed, OWEB incorporated lessons learned from the CREP techs that participated in that pilot effort, and we developed a refined monitoring approach that was adopted across all OWEB CREP TA, or technical assistance grantees. And so currently all CREP technical assistance grantees are continuing the monitoring of their CREP contracts, and they are required to summarize their monitoring results in a short report at the end of their 2-year grant. So because all the CREP techs are performing the same monitoring and reporting the results in a similar format, we are now able to roll up the monitoring results across all the counties that the monitoring is occurring and where they're working. And we are able to provide those to the Farm Services Agency in the annual report that we send to them every 2 years. And that has been a huge improvement because Farm Services Agency has always asked us, well, what are the outcomes? What are you learning from this, these investments in the CREP buffer? So it's been just a great example of how programmatic effectiveness monitoring investment trickled down to have more local benefits in relation to ag water quality areas, which is also similar to what this strategic implementation areas are focused on. So next slide, please. So again, the CREP monitoring approach that I just shared with you is an example of collaborating with local partners to develop a monitoring approach that meets our obligations under an agreement with a federal agency and to help the local partners collect data that they need to inform their work with local private landowners. So it's a win-win. We're benefiting as a state agency, local partners are benefiting to improve their work on the ground. And so the next example of collaboration that I will share here is related to monitoring coordination in Oregon, and is really focused on the work that Audrey and I do with other state natural resource agencies via a collaborative group that's called the Strategic Enterprise Approach to Monitoring, or STREAM Team. One of the products that emerges from that collaboration each year is what we call the STREAM Team Monitoring Map. Which is a resource that agency staff and other partners can use to help build efficiency when planning their monitoring efforts. This interagency water quality monitoring map is currently made available through ArcGIS Online. The map shows locations where the different state natural resource agencies are actively engaged in monitoring activities for the current calendar year. for OWEB, because Adriana, we don't do monitoring, but we fund monitoring, right? As you heard, hopefully you understand that by now. And we show the spatial information associated with the monitoring grants that we fund. This map uses points, lines, and polygons to demonstrate where, what, when, and who is collecting data in a given year by the several state natural resource agencies that participate in the stream team. And that's different from the maps that we previously showed you, right? That they only show a single location that represents an OWEB monitoring grant that's provided at the time of the application is submitted to us. So this tool is intended for use by natural resource professionals and are an example of how state agencies are working to assist OWEB on-the-ground partners to help improve monitoring coordination efforts. Next slide, please. So the puzzle pieces that we've highlighted here demonstrate how interagency collaboration and strategic implementation areas are piecing together this large puzzle that we're all working on assembling to help state agencies address water quality and quantity issues in Oregon. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Courtney to sort of wrap up everything we've been talking about.
There we go. So big breath. Like we just covered a lot. And as I go through just a couple wrap-up slides, this is just kind of a compilation of everything Ken and Audrey just talked about. And I think it's really awesome to see, like, through all these various monitoring programs that might feel like really disconnected if you're looking at the spending plan at the board meeting where you hear about one, and then the next board meeting you might hear about another. What we really wanted to demonstrate today is that they are all actually super interconnected. When we make a programmatic investment in effectiveness monitoring, the purpose is to figure out and provide resources to our grantees so that they can make informed decisions about how they're approaching monitoring on the ground, what they're approaching monitoring on the ground. And we're touching on monitoring all across the state, which means all different habitat types, all different ecological priorities, and all different types of grantees, from tribes, councils and districts, other nonprofits. And like all these pieces fit together. All of our grantees, if they're collecting, fish habitat data, it's going to ODF&W. If they're collecting water quality data, it's going to DEQ. It's informing TMDLs and TMDL implementation plans. It's informing recovery plans. It's helping inform and shape local priorities. And so it's what I even learned in working with, and I've been at OWEB, 20 years. I started in Ken's position 20 years ago. Defended my master's thesis, interviewed at OWEB the next day, and I've been here ever since. Like, I even learned a lot through putting this presentation together, just about how interconnected our monitoring programs are and how they all support the various aspects of Measure 76 and our state and federal partners. A couple of the other things I wanted to touch on here is we have supported the DEQ's Volunteer Water Quality Monitoring Program over time. We've had a couple Pacific Coastal Salmon Recovery investments in water quality monitoring data. We can't give Oregon Lottery dollars, grant dollars to other state agencies, but we have worked with PCSRF through federal funding at time to make investments in that program. And they're then loaning out their equipment to our grantees to collect data, which comes to us, which goes back into their database. A big chunk of our PCSRF funding actually goes to ODF&W to do monitoring throughout the state, which is informing recovery plans, which is helping support state and local partners and tribal partners. And we've also had funding from the Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission at times to invest in intensely monitored watersheds, which is also going to local partners and ODF&W. So I think one of the big take-home messages, and this also came through as we were working on the strategic plan update, is, and this was really the intention of how our monitoring program is currently set up, and especially when we brought on Audrey, is we want monitoring to be incorporated into all of OWEB's programs. We want it to be just woven in and how we do business at OWEB. Both facilitating getting monitoring on the ground, which is locally driven, getting monitoring on the ground that might be more strategic and board driven, and then getting the results of that data out to our local partners. As Ken and Audrey both said, we don't do the monitoring. I tell my family all the time, I push paper so other people do great work. And that's the same thing around monitoring. We want to make sure that we are supporting the type of monitoring that's needed from state, tribal, federal, local partners, and then get that data out. Ken and Audrey and I have done a lot of brainstorming about what are some new ways that we can get that data out, collaborating with the Conservation Partnership, using webinars. Ken and Audrey were just down at the local, at the annual meeting of the Watershed Councils to present on telling the restoration story. How can we collaborate with Oregon Lottery to get data out? So we're really focusing as we get into this next biennium about re-engaging and sharing the data of our grantees and the lessons that we've learned over time. And again, really want to hear from board members and committee members. Are there avenues that you would like to see OWEB out there engaging with local partners and sharing the results of the work we do? I know Ken has been to, it's blanking, Ken, up at Skamania Lodge, the big one.
Yeah, River Restoration Northwest.
River Restoration Northwest to talk about the work we've done. And so always wanting to hear where are other avenues that we can get out and talk about our investments and support the strategic plan. As we look to 25-27, this is the proposed spending plan for monitoring. I think we talked a little bit at the April board meeting, there is a little bit of reduction in the quantifying outcomes going into next biennium. And that's partially because we just made some big investments at the end of this biennium. One in the continued stage 0 effectiveness monitoring and some big investments in telling the restoration story. So we're really comfortable with this reduction going into 25-27, feeling like we'll be able to use up that $600,000. And then as we get into considering future spending plans, we'll really lean into this committee to get ideas about where should we be making investments and what is the appropriate level to have in the spending plan. So as we wrap up, wanting to think about, are there topics that we should dive deeper into in the future at this committee or at the board? Let us know as you see gaps in our monitoring investments or want more information about how all the puzzle pieces fit together. And just any other thoughts or ideas that you have about how we can continue to do this work collaboratively with the board.
Now it's just me.
Oh,
We lost.
Oh no.
I don't know what happened to Brian. Well, I do have two things.
Great.
So, one is I was listening to it. I was reflecting on the last board meeting where Jeff Huntington came and talked about how the governor's natural resource office has priorities around resilience, like climate resilience. And I think, and he talked a little bit about how they're developing, I guess, I don't know, like actions or strategic priorities or something at the GNRO level. And I was asking about how it aligned with the Oregon Climate Action Commission. But the point is just like, is that an opportunity for some investment from OWEB if like to demonstrate OWEB's value and contribution towards, if that is a priority from the governor's natural resource office, would that be a good targeted use of QCOO funds would be to try and do some work to demonstrate OWEB's contributions towards resilience efforts in the state.
That's a great question, Jesse, that I'm capturing, and I'm not seeing Sarah come back on screen. And so I know Sarah's been in conversations with Jeff and the governor's office about that work. And I think that is a great thing that I can follow up with her on to continue those conversations around our monitoring investments. And circle back with, Ken and Audrey and this committee on opportunities there. Ken?
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. I agree. That's a great question. I mean, we did, as you might recall, Jesse, when you used to be staff here at OWEB, that we provide some quantifying conservation outputs and outcomes to the Nature Conservancy to look at carbon above and below ground carbon storage associated with our riparian planting projects that we funded. And so in a way, we've started to do that. Her report is still in draft, so we don't have the findings, but we've talked to her about sharing what she's learned at Connect. We first learned about this project. She reached out to us at the Connect conference, which is a conference that's attended by watershed councils, land trusts, and soil and water conservation districts, along with other state and federal partners. And so she'll be sharing those findings. She engages with the Global Warming Commission. And so there could be other opportunities out there that are in line with the governor's, the state of Oregon's priorities related to climate resiliency. So I appreciate that. As long as I think, related to restoration actions that we're funding, I think if we can connect the dots there, it seems like an opportunity.
So Sarah, I have to laugh at that you got a call from the governor's office because we were just talking about the governor's priorities and the opportunity.
It sounds like I
to
missed
monitor.
something important there, and only because we got disconnected while they were calling. So I may have to disappear again here if they call back.
But yeah, that is kind of funny. I think just to really recap, Jesse had a great question about the governor's priorities that Jeff talked about at the April or January board meeting and resiliency, and is there opportunity for collaboration around monitoring if they're interested in the future? So
yeah, I agree with at least the end of what I heard Ken say there, which is I think that there's a strong interest in identifying some outcomes and indicators and then figuring out how we all contribute to them rather than making it sort of, I'm going to do this, you're going to do this, I'm going to do this. And so I think that sort of resiliency framework would really help us connect across agencies and show our not only enterprise-wide, but kind of interagency, intergovernmental contributions to some similar goals. And also, I'm glad it's not my job to decide what those outcomes and indicators would be, because it sounds really hard. That's one where I would much rather pay for somebody else to do it.
Jesse, you said you had a couple questions.
Well, I want to turn it over to Brian
Yeah.
and Audrey, because I've talked a lot already. So let other people chat.
Yeah, first of all, I lost connection. Sounds like some others did too, but so I've missed Courtney, just as you were closing, kind of the important final closing thoughts I totally missed. So
it's all good.
And then I missed the subsequent discussions. So I apologize for my network problems here. I guess, but I do think going back to some of the questions, what do we want to know more about moving forward? Is that kind of some of the overarching feedback you'd like to know? Right.
Yes.
So first, before I jump into that, first of all, it's a very good presentation. I've known about parts of this stuff, but not seen it all together. I think it was super helpful. It's quite clear from the presentation that OWEB's monitoring and the broader program is quite mature. And so I think, you should be, many thanks for all the hard work over many years to kind of bring these pieces together. Couple of questions regarding new things to kind of learn about. One is, it seems that post-disturbance kind of evaluations, how does restoration and how do watersheds more broadly respond to different disturbances, flood events and such? Certainly fire is a quite relevant story, but I think that's an important thing, because that's really when natural systems test these kind of treatments. So I think it'd be good to know or to hear, how much we know about that and whether there's needs to kind of lean in and take those opportunities when when Mother Nature delivers them to us, because they need to be done in that episodic way. When those events happen, we need to energize around that. So that's one kind of question. I guess the other or feedback, the other one was, and I think Ken hit on some of this, particularly in respect to the CREP presentation, is trying to do, to what degree have we done retrospectives to look at similar treatments or, treatments in a place, many years after work has been done or after cumulative suites of projects have been done. Is there an opportunity to build out there? And then two other comments. I think it's clear that we're sharing our successes and outcomes and such, but I wonder, are we also sharing, it's not as popular,
Right.
but are we sharing failures? Failure kind of sharing is not something a lot of people like to do for obvious reasons, but it's a really good way to learn so that we don't repeat those things. Is that part of our storytelling so that people are constantly learning from that? And then I'll have one last comment, and I apologize. These are a suite of comments here, but the different types of monitoring and evaluation, we have, kind of the assessment type, status and trend, restoration effectiveness. As we all know, we monitor different kind of response variables in different places for obvious reasons. There's different resources of interest. There's different concerns in those places. After that's done, do we communicate, or do the grantees communicate outcomes in a common framework that is can be integrated across sites to tell that story? So things like, to what degree were desired conditions met? Are trends static, improving, or declining? Was restoration effective on a scale of 1 to 10? Those kinds of things. Those kinds of simple communication tools can be helpful to kind of the public and to decision makers, knowing that more technical people need to dig into like how those conclusions were made, and they were made for different reasons using different data. But is there a common framework for communication around outcomes across disparate sites? So anyway, that's a set of different comments and questions, but that's some of my feedback on this. But again, I really want to step back and again recognize the great work that's been put in place.
Those are great questions, and I appreciate them. And I think one of the things that Sarah and I connected on ahead of time is what I would love to think about in a future meeting is to talk a little bit more about the reporting side, which can talk on a little bit about like how are we reporting the outcomes, what are we getting for project completion reporting related to the monitoring grants, and some of a little bit of the other reporting work we do outside of monitoring. And I think some of your questions fit really well there. And I think also we've got a couple examples that we can touch on in the future about some retrospectives we've done. And I think, if my memory is correct, and I think this was before Ken's time, we did one post-disturbance evaluation for effectiveness monitoring, and it was a big flood event in the Coast Range, and we did evaluations to see how our projects fared. And Cyrus Curry, who is now our lead IT person, was working in the monitoring section at the time, and I think he did that work. So there might be something. We'll have to dig into the archives. Before we wrap up, I think Audrey had a couple thoughts that she wanted to share based on some of Jesse's questions.
Yeah, thanks, Courtney. And I'll go backwards and I'll be super quick. Brian, thank you for all the thoughtful comments and questions. And one thing came to mind as you were talking, which is that we talked about those fit PTRs. They do have a section on challenges, lessons learned, and adaptations, and we work really closely with each initiative to not be afraid, and I don't think they are, to share, what didn't work, and then put that in a lens of how did you adapt. And definitely hear what you're saying. That was a big message that came through a lot of the channels on our strategic planning as well, is that folks need a safe space to be able to share what didn't work so that we don't repeat it. And to Courtney's point, there is a lot of energy going into looking at our reporting, our completion reporting, our post-implementation status reporting, and other ways that we have that information, but how do we make it more accessible? So just you hit on a really active point there. And then there was a conversation with Sarah and Jesse and Courtney on the climate work. And I just wanted to say, in addition to what Ken described, there is some work as OWEB administers natural and working lands funding. There's some conversations around the metrics that are used to track that funding. And it sounded like, Sarah, the Oregon Department of Energy, from what I heard, is doing what you said, and they are having outside folks kind of really hone in on those metrics. But for now, agencies are kind of working on a process that works for them, which gives OWEB an opportunity to look at our metrics in light of natural working lands funding. Thanks.
Thanks, Audrey. Jesse, I think we wrap up from here and think of next topics for the next meeting. From my notes, and please let me know if I missed anything, I think talking and shifting a little bit about reporting and what we do with reporting, I think both bigger agency as well as on the monitoring side. And I'm really intrigued by your comment, Brian, about post-disturbance. And I know we've done a lot of investments, both with lottery and general funds for post-fire and drought. And might be really interesting to hear from Renee or Renee's staff to hear a little bit about what they've been doing post-disturbance evaluation. Sound pretty good?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Well, thank you both for joining today. I will likely send around an email to the whole committee and just encourage them to look at the slides and listen to the recording, because I think Ken and Audrey hit it out of the park, and I can't thank them enough for their work on this.
Yes, great job.
Thanks.
Have a great rest of the day, and both of you take care of yourselves.
Thank you.